Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And happy Halloween to you, or the month of Halloween. That's October 2021. And if you're listening to this between October 1st and October 5th, and you don't have an ebook copy of my novel, The Black Palace, go on Amazon.com and grab you one for free for 5 days. They're giving them away for free. And so check that out. Related to publications, today I wanted to talk to you about some ideas I have regarding Ringwraiths and Dracula. Ringwraiths, of course, being those fantastic monsters out of Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And you already know Dracula. We've done episodes on him before, and he keeps popping up everywhere. I ended up writing out some of these ideas and observations I noticed about, well, what makes them so similar? In fact, are they so similar that maybe Tolkien was inspired by or doing his version of Dracula? I think maybe so. I wrote these out and in essay form. Normally, I just get on here and talk to you about my ideas, but in that time, it turned into an essay. That fortunately, it got picked up by a scholarly journal I've been admiring for years. If you're into Tolkien studies, if you like studying J.R.R. Tolkien like I do, there is one premier publication for scholarly papers on Tolkien. That's Tolkien Studies, an annual scholarly review put out by West Virginia University Press, and some brilliant and generous editors too. One of whom has already been on the show a little while back. Michael Drought was here discussing the monsters in Beowulf. He also happens to be a Beowulf expert, and we slid in some talk on monsters in Tolkien as well. That was a really cool episode. Check that one out if you haven't. And other editors as well, Verlin Flieger and David Bratman. By the way, if I butchered the pronunciation of your names, I'm sorry. I've only ever read the names, and so sometimes often I screw up pronunciations. Um, Part of the so where can you find the actual journal itself? Well, in libraries all over the place. I think college and university libraries are the best place to check them out. You can also electronically find it on Project Muse if you have a subscription through them. But part of the contract on publication was that 12 months after it gets published, I get to share a version of it. And so I've put a version of that essay up on my website, joshwoodsauthor.com, if you want to read it word for word. But I also wanted to just share the ideas with you now. I don't want to read it to you word for word. You can do that on your own if you're interested. But if you just want to hear what the ideas are, I want to talk about with you here. And I'll read some quotations from Tolkien and some quotations from Bram Stoker. But otherwise, I'll just go through them. So how about let's go through them? Ringwraiths are weird. They're weirder than all the other monsters in Lord of the Rings, I think. Weirder even than Balrogs, which are there's lots to discuss on Balrogs and lots to debate, like such as whether or not they have wings. Um, but but no other creatures have this same array of arbitrary limitations and weaknesses and powers that Ringwraiths do. And I happen to think they sure do match up with Dracula. Let's think in this order, like light, water, how they go out in their death, the drinking blood thing, the inviting them to come in the house, turning others into undead, shape shifting, curse and imprisonment. Um, so, so first of all, light. Um, well, I should back up. Where am I getting these details on how ring wraiths are? They're scattered throughout. You can pick up details on what's up with ring wraiths, so like what kind of creatures are they and what their powers and weaknesses are by reading Lord of the Rings. But that's scattered. Tolkien wrote a lot of essays, articles, letters, and notes on all sorts of background info and side note details on Lord of the Rings that he never published in his lifetime, but his son, Christopher Tolkien, who was in charge of the estate, lived a long and really impressive life of scholarship of his dad's work. Only recently did he pass, but he put together a lot of what his father never published and published them. Unfinished Tales is one of those collections. And that's where Tolkien just gets right at it and talks about Ring-wraiths and wizards, the Astari, and all sorts of other details that you always kind of wanted to know about in The Lord of the Rings. It's a very cool read. For instance, what he says of the Ring-wraiths in The Hunt for the Ring within Unfinished Tales. Tolkien says, all except the Witch King were apt to stray when alone by daylight, and all, again save the Witch King, feared water, and were unwilling, except in dire need, to enter it or to cross streams unless dry-shod by a bridge. Moreover, their chief weapon was terror. This was actually greater when they were unclad and invisible, and it was greater also when they were gathered together. I think there's a lot to pick apart there. First of those being light. Tolkien says in Unfinished Tales that about the Ringwraiths, their power was most confused and diminished by daylight. And on in Lord of the Rings itself, in Fellowship of the Ring, Strider, when they're on Weathertop, when he's talking to the hobbits about Ringwraiths, he says, quote, they themselves do not see the world of light as we do, but our shapes cast shadows in their minds, which only the noon sun destroys. And in the dark they perceive many signs and forms that are hidden from us. Then they are most to be feared. This matches up with what Van Helsing says about Count Dracula, but also what we can see in Count Dracula. Van Helsing mentions quite briefly, he can see in the dark. No small power is this, in a world which is one half shut from the light. Now there, Van Helsing was talking more about day and night, but I think Tolkien thought, well, what about one half of the world, a visible half of the world, and what about a non-visible part of the world? So you have other alternate worlds. We'll come back to that one in a second. But about this being diminished in daylight, Dracula wasn't destroyed by sunlight. If you know the film versions of it, then sure. I think that started with Count Orlok and Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu. That's the first time Dracula shows up on film that we have copy of. There are speculations about a lost film, Dracula, from 1920, but as far as we know, that doesn't exist anymore. By the way, anybody who finds it finds the holy grail of monster movies, if any copy out there exists. I don't think it does anymore. Um, but so in Nosferatu, the vampires is just the sun comes up and he's reduced to just ash. But in the novel Count Dracula, Orlok, by the way, Nosferatu was a direct film version of Dracula. They just didn't get to call it Dracula anymore because of a copyright dispute with Bram Stoker's wife. So they changed it, Nosferatu, Count Orlok, whatever. So in and Dracula's not hurt at all by the sunlight, but, and not any more than Ringwraiths are, but just like Ringwraiths, his senses are dulled by day, he has lesser powers by day, he is weakened by day, and he can't really get much done. He pretty much has to wait out night to really reach his full form. So you can go, yeah, well, there's a lot of creatures in Lord of the Rings that can't handle sunlight, orcs and trolls and that kind of stuff. Okay, that does match up, but so do others. Well, how about water, though? Water is weird in that I don't know of any other creature in Tolkien's Legendarium that have a fear of crossing water. And that's maybe the sunlight thing isn't unique, but that certainly is. And And it's an odd thing. The ringwraiths are afraid to cross water. They'll only do it if they're really forced and panicked, and they'll go way out of their way to not cross water. In fact, Christopher Tolkien notes that, quote, his, quote, father nowhere explained the ringwraith's fear of water. As in nowhere. Now he did describe it, but he didn't explain like why or what. Um, and in fact, that main attack on Osgiliath in the Lord of the Rings was for the Ringwraiths of Minas Morgul to, quote, to force the passage of the bridge of Osgiliath, they over the Anduin. They needed a way across that big great river that kind of runs almost like the Mississippi through our section of Middle Earth. They had no way of crossing such a big, ancient, and powerful river except over a bridge, and they had to fight a battle just to get a hold of that bridge to get themselves across it. And then once they were across it and they're heading northwest toward the Shire, um, they are greatly hindered by having to avoid river crossings over and over again. And in fact, Tolkien, as he's trying to describe where the Ringwraiths went and going through his own map, he found it was pretty hard to get them up to the Shire and getting them to avoid river crossings. He even mentions in Unfinished Tales that trying to stick to this rule that Ringwraiths don't cross water was, quote, or quote, was difficult to sustain. And I don't know how often you hear Tolkien admitting these kinds of things, but once he sets this rule as a writer, he sticks to it. Part of what makes his work so fascinating. Um, so they're not always. You can go, well, what about you? You might be remembering some moments where ringwraiths are in water in that ford of Bruinen. True, they were not always incapable of entering running water. But Tolkien says in Unfinished Tales in the notes that they only dared to enter the river due to the lure of the ring straight before them. So they were, even then, they didn't want to go, but they had the ring right there, right in front of them. And so they hesitantly went in. And of course, it went bad for them immediately, just like they feared. Um, but they're hesitant to cross it, and they'll do everything they can to avoid crossing water. That delayed them there at Bruinen, that delayed them at Buckleberry Ferry, that delayed them all over the place. Now you're thinking, what the hell does that have to do with Dracula? Well, if you know the film version's best, then nothing in the film version that has the fear of water is not very cinematic, or at least it wasn't when Dracula became iconic in cinema history. But if you remember the novel or you remember the book Dracula, then it was a huge plot point. Dracula could not cross. Well, Van Helsing says it. Quote: "He can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide." That ends up being a pivotal plot point for the characters in the book when they're racing back to Dracula's home and he's racing back to his home, and they're going to meet there for their climactic battle. It's the hindrance of crossing water that slows down Dracula. And he has to wait till low tide to get off of his ship and get across water over to land, and then that's what gives Van Helsing and his crew the lead to get there before he does, or get there in time to destroy him. And so where else but Dracula do you find crossing water being an important plot point in fighting an undead enemy? Well, only one other place that I know of, and that's Lord of the Rings in with the Ringwraiths. And so you have this weird can't cross water rule for both of them. Um, and when Van Helsing and his crew end up getting to Dracula, and then they end up killing him by the end of the book, wouldn't you know that he's killed in much the same way, or that Dracula is killed in much the same way that the Ringwraiths end up being killed, or I should say the Witch King, the main one. Now, This idea isn't mine. This one comes from Suze Losnick, an article that she wrote. And so that's the first time I came across this idea, and I think she's right. She says they're both killed, the Witch King and Dracula. In their final moments, they're both killed by a double stabbing, as in two different characters stab them together to kill them. For Dracula, it was Morris and Harker, and for the Witch King, it was Mary and Eowyn, and they both end up stabbing. And I think if you look at their last moments, both of them, you see a whole lot of other parallels, not just the two stabbings. Well, listen for them. I want to see if you can pick up on these. I'm going a little bit beyond Sue's Losnick here, or not beyond, but in a slightly different place where she focused all of her explanation. But she led me here. So the final moments of Dracula go like this. He was deathly pale, just like a waxen image, and the red eyes glared with the horrible vindictive look which I knew too well. As I looked, the eyes saw the sinking sun, and the look of hate in them turned to triumph. But on the instant came the sweep and flash of Jonathan's great knife. I shrieked as I saw it shear through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's bowie knife plunged into the heart. It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumpled into dust and passed from our sight. That's the end of Dracula. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, what about the stake through the heart? Nope, that's not how Dracula went out. You don't use a stake or a wooden stake. You use a good old Texas Bowie knife. And Jonathan Harker had a kukri blade. It was an Indonesian kind of knife. And so Bram Stoker liked particular types of knives since he named them, by the way. But nope, no stake. If you want to kill a vampire Dracula style, you get a good old American Bowie knife and you plunge it through the heart. That's how you kill a vampire. But there are other details and moments going on there. Let's compare that to the final moments of the Witch King. So here that comes from Lord of the Rings. But I'm going to skip a little bit of a part here and explain what I need to as I go along in case it confuses. So it says, upon it sat a shape black-mantled, huge and threatening. A crown of steel he bore, but between rim and robe naught was there to see, save only the dead gleam of eyes. The Lord of the Nazgul. I'm skipping over a part here, by the way. And then he bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill, but suddenly he too stumbled forward with a cry of bitter pain, and his stroke went wide, driving into the ground. Mary's sword had stabbed him from behind, shearing through the black mantle and passing up beneath the hauberk. That's his, essentially his male skirt shirt, and beneath the hauberk, and pierced the sinew behind his mighty knee. Eowyn, Eowyn, cried Mary. Then tottering, struggling up, with her last strength she drove her sword between crown and mantle as the great shoulders bowed before her. Or bowed before her, I should say. The sword broke sparkling into many shards. The crown rolled away with a clang. Eowyn fell forward upon her fallen foe. But lo, the mantle and hauberk were empty. Shapeless they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled, and a cry went up into the shuddering air and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind, a voice bodiless and thin that died and was swallowed up and was never heard again in that age of the world. And so you have, if you're thinking about that, like, okay, I noticed more than just, okay, they were both double stabbed by two heroes, and in fact, you could say they were both slashed and stabbed, like pierced and slashed at the same time. Yes, you'd be right. But you might have noticed other connections there. This motif of breath, this motif of wind and of voice in both of them. Also, you have the Dracula's glaring red eyes and the Witch King's deadly gleam of eyes, both right before their final destruction. So that's a pretty particular or pretty specific set of parallels, I would have to say, in the final moments of both. Um, and at this point, maybe you're going, yeah, 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 but vampires drink blood. That's what they do, right? So get us there, Woods. What about the blood drinking? Well, okay. No, Ringwraiths don't drink blood as vampires do. Or, well, okay, maybe what I should say is I don't know for sure that they do. It's not clear whether or not they do, but there's something there anyway. When Strider's talking to the hobbits about what the Ringwraiths are, he says, quote, "And at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring it and hating it." Now you're like, well, that kind of sounds like Gollum with the One Ring, right? He desires it and he hates it too. Yeah, yeah, that's a similar kind of thing. But for the Ringwraiths, it's not the One Ring like Gollum and like so many other characters. They don't desire the ring. They're just ordered to go after the one who has it or go after it. Um, what if the Witch King would have seized the One Ring? Well, we could, fan theory debate that all we need to, but we don't need to because Tolkien said exactly what would happen in Unfinished Tales. Quote, he says, if one of them, even the Witch King, their captain, had seized the One Ring, he would have brought it back to his master. They don't desire the ring. They're already under control of the rings that they were given. They're slaves to their master and ultimately slaves to the ring. They could have been ordered by Frodo had he commanded it too. That's actually Tolkien writes quite a bit on what would have happened if Frodo, having claimed the ring at the end, lasted a bit longer, long enough for the Ringwraiths to get to him. It's quite fascinating, but anyway, it's slightly off track. Back on track there. The Ringwraiths don't desire the ring. They only have one stated desire. We just read it. The blood of living things. And so they seem to have only this one desire if they have any at all. Well, they do have one. And they themselves no longer possess living blood or the blood of living things. And so it might be this kind of desire for this thing that they've lost because they are in this undead state. Now, the blood drinking gets weirder though, because in Fellowship of the Rings, Gandalf's giving the backstory of how they lost track of Gollum because they had him captured earlier in the story and they lost him. And he says that when in the middle of that account, he says the woodman said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed trees to find nests. It crept into holes to find the young. It slipped through windows to find cradles. Now, who was it? I mean, this is like a vampire, or this could be like talking about Count Dracula or talking about Lucy, both of whom prey on children, right? And a ghost that drinks blood sneaks into home at night and drinks the blood of infants in their cradles. And this was going on in the Lord of the Rings world, and in and around Mirkwood. So what's going on there? Well, you could say, well, was that about Gollum? I mean, maybe. That's the overall context. It could have been a side note, but I mean that was the overall context that Gandalf was talking about. But he never says it was Gollum. Nobody ever actually knows who it was. And when we end up meeting Gollum later, that's not how he acts at all. He's not a ghost that moves through the night to drink blood. He likes to munch on cold, slimy fish. He never shows any interest in drinking warm blood from people. Um, there was somebody else in Mirkwood at the time, though. Not the necromancer, who was another name for Sauron when he was not quite identified yet as Sauron, just this powerful sorcerer. He had already left Mirkwood, his fortress at Dol Guldur, long before these events. There was someone else there, and it was the second in command among the Ring-wraiths. Not the Witch King, but Kamul the Black Easterling. In Unfinished Tales, in his notes, Tolkien gives the second in command Ringwraith a name and tells us a little bit about him. And unlike what we know of Gollum, whose desires do not match up with the drinking of blood, we know that Kamul, the Black Easterling, who is in Mirkwood at the time of these rumors, has already been stated by Strider as having this desire and hate for, but also desire for the blood of living things, which he smells at all times. Kamul, the Black Easterling, by the way, is also the same Ringwraith, the one that goes around sniffing. And earlier, he goes to Gaffer Gamgee and Farmer Maggot, both looking for the hobbits, and he's sniffing the whole time, and that's noted over and over. What is he sniffing? Well, we only have one clue: the blood of all living things, which he desires, and might very well have been drinking the blood of infants, and as the ghost who drinks blood in the night. Um, Also, by the way, when Gaffer Gamgee gets approached by Kamul, the second in charge Ringwraith, he tells him to get out of here. He uninvites him, and he leaves. Farmer Maggot uninvites him, and he leaves. Why would the Ringwraith do what these tiny little farmers tell him to do? Well, that's kind of like Count Dracula, isn't it? Van Helsing explains that Dracula, quote, may not enter anywhere at the first unless there be someone in the household who bid him come. So maybe that's another parallel we have there. So wait a minute. Do ringwraiths drink blood or do they not drink blood? Well, it's never quite clear, but Kamul, the Black Easterling, might very well have been the blood drinker, and they only desire blood. And so I'm starting to think maybe kinda. What about Dracula's ability, or yeah, what about the vampire, the Dracula ability to turn others undead? Um, and how does that happen with Count Dracula? Well, he drinks a little bit of his victim's blood night after night, bit by bit, and slowly they fade and become a vampire. And not just a vampire on their own, they become specifically vampires under his command. And that's a big part of their imprisonment and their being turned. Well, the Ringwraiths do this to Frodo at Weathertop. The Witch King stabs Frodo in the shoulder with a Morgul knife, and he leaves a splinter of it in the wound. And bit by bit, night after night, Frodo starts to fade and fade and fade and by the time they get to the Ford of Bruinen, trying really hard to get to Elrond to help heal him from the splinter that's making him fade, by then he's already half in the Wraith world, according to the text, and very nearly becoming, quote, a wraith under the dominion of the Dark Lord. And so Dracula bites, Ringwraiths puncture. That's kind of a parallel there. And once they do, it's this bit by bit incremental transition until they are faded from the living world into the undead world, and they lose their free will. They are under the dominion of either the Ringwraith or the vampire. Um, so that's a whole lot of parallels, but they keep coming. I think. What about the shape-shifting ringwraiths undergo? Because we know that Dracula has some shape-shifting, right? He has the form of an old man, turns into the form of a young man. He can turn into mist, which sometimes the movies do, not too often. But he can turn into a mist, he can turn into a bat, and in all these forms, he's always emanating terror, right? Well, as the Ringwraiths begin the hunt for for the ring, when they're heading northwest after they cross the bridge, they don't have bodies or shapes. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien says, quote, unclad and unmounted, invisible to eyes, and yet a terror to all living things that they passed near. That's how they traveled, moving like air, and in a way being this kind of mist of terror that can't really be seen, or you could say maybe just invisible shapes moving up. Okay, then they take up this concrete form, and black riders mounted on horses, and then when they're destroyed, then they take up a new and more terrifying form. Now they're riders on these fell creatures that fly on leathery wings. They're not dragons, but I think that Peter Jackson's version of it did a pretty good job of making them look like gross flying lizard kind of things. But they are leathery winged things that fly, these fell creatures through the night. And so you got kind of a version of mist shape, you have kind of a version of leathery winged flying shape, and you have kind of a version of a man shape. And they go through all of these transitions. Well, don't all creatures in Lord of the Rings do all this stuff? No. No, it's pretty unique well, pretty unique. You can't be pretty unique, right? It's close to unique in Tolkien's world. In the tale of Beren and Luthien, you do get shape shifting. But beyond that, it's mostly Ringwraiths, and it just so happens to have some parallels with Dracula. Um, Maybe more abstract than all that is this parallel of curse and imprisonment. The Ringwraiths are slaves in undeath, right? They are as explained over and over again, and then you can kind of see it happening a little bit with Gollum, with Bilbo, with Frodo. The power of the ring stretches out your years and stretches out your existence, but not your life, right? Until you become this kind of imprisoned thing in undeath that doesn't really get a life. Well, Van Helsing takes time to talk about that with Dracula. He says, quote, when they become such, as in when these people become vampires, when they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on, age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. Which that's Stoker, even though that sounded like Tolkien a little bit in many ways. So they're cursed to just keep on going and going and stretching out their age and existence without getting new vitality or new life. Uh, 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 Van Helsing also says, quote, he, talking about Dracula, he says, quote, he can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave in the galley, or than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. We know why we know not. And so, in many ways, they're both imprisoned in this immortal undeath in which they don't get life, they just get more and more existence that they're stuck to, and not free but slaves of this world. uh well, what about what they used to be before they turned into these immortal things? Well, we get a clear vision of the Witch King and Camul the Black Easterling, both as being warlords and sorcerers in their own rights. Well, what was Dracula beforehand? Was he a warlord and a sorcerer like the Ringwraiths, or at least the two that we know the backstory of? Yeah, he was. Van Helsing says of Dracula in Dracula, uh, soldier, statesman, and alchemist, he had a mighty brain, a learning beyond compare, and a heart that knew no fear and no remorse. He dared even to attend the scolomancy. By the way, that was this a reference to the school of black magic said to have been taught by the devil. I don't know what tuition is, but I bet you don't want to pay it. But no, that none of that's in the text. By the way, that was a side note. Okay, back to the text. It says, and there was no branch of knowledge of his time that he did not essay. By the way, that means try out, essay. Well, in him the brain power survived the physical death, though it would seem that memory was not all complete. So you have this undead creature who at one time was a powerful sorcerer and a wise and powerful warlord as well in The Witch King, in Camel the Black Easterling, and in Count Dracula. And by the way, Sue Zlosnick did point out you have the villain from the East, like this foreigner from the evil East, intruding upon the good and righteous West. These kind of images going on, and maybe that's what Dracula was doing. Well, yeah, it was. It just so happens to be the most Dracula of all the Ringwraiths. Kamul the Black Easterling was this evil guy from the east, intruding on the west. So there's that. Maybe I won't get too deep into that, but that's at least one more parallel. Okay, so maybe that's enough to make my case that Tolkien was inspired by or had this impulse, and that's what I want to talk next, is just to round this out to say why, what was up with that. We have these parallels and perhaps influences with light, with water, with their death, and this double stabbing in these final moments, and these key motifs in their final moments of drinking blood, even of this invitation to enter or be there. Turning others into the undead, shape shifting in these three specific forms, this sense of curse and imprisonment, this backstory about being a warrior sorcerer. Why? Why would Tolkien do all this? Like, well, you could say influence is influence, it just happens, true, but I think we could even dig a little bit deeper than that. Tolkien, quite a bit, did this thing, and many people have noted it. I think it was best described as writing into the gap. That's not what I call it, but I think that's most popular anyway. By the way, that's Tom Shippey's phrase, and he's the world's premier scholar on Tolkien. Fortunately, we got to have him on an episode in which he lays out, for the first time that he's ever released or published, his taxonomy of monsters, essentially the biology. So, or this like a family tree of monsters. So, whatever monster there is in fiction, you can find where they fall under these family groups and branches, almost like a biological family and genus and species tree. Um, some of you were asking, why didn't you talk about Lord of the Rings and Tolkien with Tom Shippey? Not actually, I shouldn't say much, but if you're watching what's coming out in TV series form soon, and you know the kinds of people they bring in as experts on those things, and you know what kinds of copyright non-disclosure agreement silence rules they have on each other. Let me just vaguely say, if you know what's coming out related to Tolkien on a streaming service, then you know why Tom Shippey wasn't really talking about Tolkien with me. And just so happened that he had a fantastic, cool array of ideas to share with me about monsters that didn't have to involve Tolkien anyway, so it was a great episode. So, side note, anyway, back to our point. He called it writing into the gap. What is that? I call it, when I do this kind of thing as a fictional writer myself, I tend to call it the reparative impulse, in which you see other things that you admire, that intrigue you, but you see kind of like what seem like to you blind spots, or perhaps flaws in something, things that aren't quite like you want them to be a little bit better or fixed or different. Now, that's entirely subjective, right? To somebody else, that might be perfect, but your mind wanted it to be fixed in this way or that way. And so you retell your version of it that is fixed in your way. Tolkien did this kind of thing all the time. Like, for instance, the nursery rhyme "Hey diddle diddle," where the cow jumps over the moon, and the cat and the fiddle and the fork and dancing with the spoon and stuff. It's a nonsense rhyme, right? And Tolkien hated nonsense. He wanted everything to fit together in a logical and rational order, or at least not rational, but one that could be understood. He wanted things to fit. And so what does he have Frodo do in Lord of the Rings? At the Prancing Pony, he has him make up a song in which you get the whole backstory to Hey Diddle Diddle. And so everything makes sense, so that when you finally get the image that we're left with in the nursery rhyme of all these chaotic nonsense things happening, you know where they all came from. It's a very long song that Frodo makes up on the spot, and it kind of fixes or repairs the Hey Diddle Diddle nursery rhyme. Tolkien wanted to do this all the time. Even the Shire calendar, right? It fixed our clunky off balance calendar. Right now we have 360 days. No, that's degrees in a circle. Like the sun goes around the earth, not the sun goes around the earth. Well, maybe. Okay, but I misspoke. The earth goes around the sun, not as a full circle in 360 degrees, but 365.25. Well, that's sloppy and clunky. Tolkien wanted things to be fixed and rounded off and balanced and fit together. He wanted 360 days, like 360 degrees, like a circle. So he develops the Shire calendar, in which we have a cleanly circular year of 360 days plus a short week in between the years that doesn't fit as a year, and that covers the 5.25. And so now he fixed our calendar, if you count by the Shire calendar. And so anyway, he had this impulse to do this. So I think that what he ended up doing with Dracula is seeing all this fascinating stuff, but he saw some blind spots in how this warrior sorcerer was cursed, or cursed himself beyond death, so that he must go on age after age, and all his weird powers and weaknesses, and the blood and the water and the light and the transformation and the curse and imprisonment. Like he wanted it all to fit together. It ends up being mysterious and arbitrary in Dracula, and it kind of all makes sense with the Ring-wraiths. And so I think he breathed new life into the undead. So if you made it this far, you survived another episode of The Monster Professor. I hope you enjoyed some of those ideas, and maybe that'll get you to revisit, or perhaps visit the first time, some of those great works: Lord of the Rings, Unfinished Tales, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. And so, happy Halloween.